Rutgers football defeats Maryland 31-17 on Saturday. David Anderson back to talk the big victory. In my podcast early on Monday, I talked about how it was great to see the Rutgers offense come through in the game where they could exploit the defense of Maryland. Obviously, a huge win for the program to become bowl eligible. David, what were some of the biggest takeaways that stuck out to you in this victory for the Scarlet Knights?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Aaron. And I didn't lose my voice yelling at the TV like I have on other times. But I guess let me just start on the offense. There's really three main ones that you would take away. One, and we were texting during the game, Kyle Monangai. Maryland was doing what we said in the preview, which is filling their running lanes solidly. They were basically forcing Rutgers to pass. When Rutgers was forced to pass, they were surrendering certain passing lanes, but they were not going to let Kyle Monangai beat them in a conventional ground game manner. So Rutgers had to balance the fact that their passing game was connecting pretty well with the fact that you have to keep getting Kyle Monangai the ball. He's the heartbeat of your team. So certain plays he made that were jukes behind the line. There was one, I think, that set up the first fourth down conversion in the first half where it should have been, a loss of 2. Instead, he gained like 6 or 7 yards, and it set up a 4th and 4. I'm not sure if that was a second or third down play. And then they even threw it to him one side of the backfield, which is something we talked about preseason, just to keep getting him the ball and keep Maryland from just abandoning that game plan and switching to pass defense. So they ran the ball well enough to just keep the things moving. And then my other two on offense, one, this was covered, I think, by Fonseca and Lanny on the NJ.com Rutgers rant. I mean, whenever Rutgers needed Dymere Miller or Ian Strong to catch a slant a route or a crosser, they were there. I can't even remember when they could do that in the past. That wasn't even something Carew did. And then the third takeaway from the offense is despite the injuries on the offensive line, they trusted their offensive line to pass protect in key situations. How many times on third down, even last year, was Rutgers not only scared because of their quarterback's accuracy issues, but because of their offensive line and pass protection to drop back and throw it on a 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7 when they were ahead, or even a 2nd and 10 when they had maybe been incomplete on first down. And even earlier this season when we saw the 3 straight sacks against Virginia Tech. So that is a credit to the players, the offensive line coaches, as well as the offensive coordinator all together to kind of assemble this and work together to make a protective unit. So I know, you've already had plenty of post-game coverage, but between the lines, those three things really stuck out to me as areas where Rutgers has improved year over year, as well as in season on the offensive side.
Yeah, I think it just shows the evolution of the offense and just Shiraka's ability to adapt and kind of utilize the personnel to its strengths now as the season's gone on. And like you said, I mean, they were a 1-note offense last year. If Monangai wasn't able to run, they weren't able to do anything. I think that was the most encouraging thing against Maryland was that they made so many key passes to change the game that it's just something we haven't fully seen in quite a while. Thoughts on the defense in terms of another strong performance? Edwards, it's funny, he's now up to number 2 in passing yards per game in the Big Ten, but obviously Calic Menace outperformed Edwards, and a big part of that was the job of the Rutgers defense did on him.
Yeah, I think there's really 2 main takeaways if we just want to talk about that. One is, and this is starting to become a trend throughout all of football, there are certain quarterbacks that can't get outside the pocket. You think of like an older Tom Brady or even, unfortunately, Aaron Rodgers right now. Even an Eli Manning isn't the guy who you would want to get outside. But most of the quarterbacks have a little bit of running ability, and most of the quarterbacks can be dangerous when they get outside the pocket. So they have certain numbers of throws they can make from inside the pocket. And we saw when Rutgers kept Max Brosmer in there last week that they were able to mostly contain him because they were basically able to limit the size of the playbook and the number of routes he was able to throw from inside the pocket. Same thing here with Edwards, where, yeah, he's throwing for a lot of yards. He's got a lot of attempts, but he's really at his best when he uses those legs. They let him get loose a couple times, but remember, this is the guy they used as a pure running quarterback last year in the beatdown when he just ran Rutgers to death in that second half. So this is a guy with moves and wheels, and he just never got comfortable. And I think it's because they kept him in the pocket. And then when the game came down in the crunch time, there were two key pass defended, one by Aaron Lewis, one by, I believe it was Malcolm Ray. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
But
you're right.
you don't get those passes when the quarterback is outside the pocket. And even though, yes, you have to defend the whole field, he can't see like secondary action, and he might not even be able to see all of his reads. So by keeping him in the pocket, that pairs well with the other key takeaway from the defense, which is the biggest difference between, let's say, this game and UCLA, because UCLA, USC, they had plenty of athletes as well. Rutgers really forced tight window throws. Like there was a couple where he did fire it in there. There was one in the first half on a key drive for Maryland when they scored, where there was literally 7 Rutgers defenders that collapsed on the back, and you're like, how was no one closer to him? Well, it was just a perfect pass. If that pass was off in any direction, it would have been a knockaway, an interception, anything. But they shrunk those windows, and that was one of the key things from the Minnesota game that we weren't sure if it would be sustainable. Are they making quarterbacks make tough throws? So even though Edwards did complete some of those plays, he had to be so accurate so often that anything that goes awry, like the ball slips out of your hand a little bit, or you have to double pump, or it gets bad down at the line, any of those things, and you really made it difficult, which is obviously not something that they did against UCLA or USC. So it was really tightening the windows in tandem with maintaining the pocket. Do not let him escape the pocket. That was a key factor in the defense having, I guess you could say the Nebraska game might have been their best performance of the year, but this was probably their second.
Yeah, I felt like this game for the defense, it was more, maybe they weren't as dominant as they were against Nebraska, but their ability to make key plays at key moments. Even like the Bo Mascal breakup in the end zone was massive. He just did that flawlessly. And just in terms of, you mentioned Ray and Lewis with deflections late in the game. Thoughts on, I wanted to ask you specifically about the Loyal play when he stripped the receiver and the ball went up in the air, Jordan Thompson making that play, and just Loyal's performance overall in this game, leading Rutgers with 13 tackles, 10 solo.
Well, it's kind of two things. One, a perfectly thrown ball there, and I think that pass might be caught. But because Rutgers had shrunk those windows, they had a defender in the area. And then not only that, they had another defender in the area for the tip, which we haven't always seen from this team, but has been a hallmark of Shiano defenses in the past. And then the other thing that I would take from that is just these guys in this game were playing for the man next to them. And, short of saying like comparing this to pros where guys should do that, and we haven't seen it, especially from some of the local teams lately, guys playing for themselves and things like that. This team could have packed it in, but they kept going. Not only they keep going, they didn't necessarily like quietly quit. It's like a new term the last couple of years about people at their jobs working from home. It's like they didn't do that either. It's not like they're just going through the motions. We used to just call it going through the motions. Now it's got a different title. But like Jordan Thompson, it's not the first interception of his career either. I mean, this is a guy who he's really not known for being in coverage, but he executed his assignment and he was there. I mean, Larry Kay was just gushing over Loyal's performance in the post game, which I think is fair. And then the other thing I want to add to that is just one of the things we talked about preseason, and maybe even the offseason, about one of the reasons Michigan was doing well and Ohio State was starting to struggle was like that state pride and grit. And when you have the core of your team, and I'm not saying, let's take Robert Longerbeam for an example, right? I'm not saying you can't have a Robert Longerbeam on your team who is like, dedicated to Rutgers. He almost left one time, didn't leave, like doubled down on his commitment. But when the core bones of your team are all from New Jersey, not all, but a good percentage are from New Jersey, they can talk about their experience as a kid. They can talk about this means something to them, whether it be Aaron Lewis, whether it be, even Holland Pierce on offense, Colin Munungai. Like, they are the backbone of your team. And then you have these other guys. Even Athan's got a family connection, but he's not like a Jersey guy through and through. So when you have your Jersey guy like that and Loyal coming through with plays like that, like it makes it easier to assimilate everyone into that culture. And one of the things that, Maryland has probably been criticized for, even though they recruit the DMV quite well, is they haven't always had that same pride that Rutgers has had when they've been doing well. And so I think Loyal, played a great game. He's probably more healthy than he's been, but there's so many things to take away from his performance in a game where they really needed him to have his best game because of Maryland's speed on the perimeter and him being one of their faster guys at his position, something I've harped on over and over and over again, was needed to come through in this game, and he did even more than anyone could have expected.
Yeah, great points. I think that's really kind of the core of the culture at Rutgers under Graciano is getting those hometown guys to be a huge part of that culture and the grit of this team. And excellent point in terms of that showing out in this game. And I think it's not just that they were able to tread water and get through the bad moments, but they actually got better. It wasn't
Right.
just a matter
Right.
of surviving the bad times. This team has made marked steps forward since even that USC game. And I think the coaching staff too, and this is something we talked offline, we're talking about how the decision making of the coaching staff, we talked how they were kind of off balance most of the season in terms of they were risk taking, but it was kind of in weird spots, or some of the risks were bad calculations, even though it's kind of easy to say that in hindsight. We felt it in the moment. Where this game, it just felt like they were hitting every single stride in terms of making the right call for the most part. There's a couple nitpick things at the end, but I thought that 4th and 2 was just so key to the psyche of this team, something we've kind of touched on all year. The confidence it gave them and to execute and not even just try to run it up the gut, but run that slant to Miller. I guess any thoughts you want to give in terms of the coaching staff and how important they were in this victory?
Several. I mean, someone had said it, maybe even been Fonseca after the game, or actually might have been on Bobby Darin's podcast. They were talking about the coaches almost had a perfect game, almost. And the thing that I was texting you during the game was at the end of that first half, the way that Rutgers clock managed, and they beat Maryland strategically and not allowing points, but also knocking the clock so that Maryland couldn't mount a long drive. Like those sorts of things, when to call timeout. I mean, those things, they kind of get lost when you get blown out. But, so many times, burning a timeout in the first play of a drive or something like that, when you don't do that, it really allows you to shine in those key situations. I was perfectly fine with when they went, as everyone keeps calling it, like into the turtle shell at the end, for the simple reason that they didn't do it with 10 minutes left when they could have. Even though that drive only took, I want to say, like 2.5 minutes, that ended up setting up a field goal, it put them up by 14. And when you're up by 14, that's such a different situation than they were a week ago against Minnesota. Because against Minnesota, what you saw was by only being up 10, they could kick one field goal, save time. But if you are up by 2 touchdowns, much like we saw almost kind of like in the Washington game to some extent, I know the amount of time that it took them to move down the field didn't give them any time for that field goal at the end. So whether you get the field goal earlier or you take the field goal later, right? So Minnesota went for the field goal earlier, whereas Washington went for the field goal second, in those two games being somewhat different. Either way, you can save time by just kicking a field goal that you think you can make. But when you're down by 14, like how many times did Maryland have to go for it in Rutgers territory when they probably could have kicked a field goal in that fourth quarter that it would have made it a 7-point game potentially? But when it's 14 points, there's just decisions that the other team has to make that are in your favor. And you see this in the NFL all the time. So the clock management, time management, things like that, it was fine. And then also the fact that they burned them with that pass down the sideline with like 10 minutes left. And then Ethan did it after they went to the 4 receivers. He faked it and ran to the outside, and there was not an extra defender there because they had taken somebody out of the box. Like all the coaching staff stuff in terms of game management was pretty much spot on. And then also they were building on top of each other. Like the reason I look back at that 4th and 2 play, I was kind of surprised they went for it, to be honest. But the process made sense because when I rewatched it, the play before, which Ethan kind of had to throw away because he had seen pressure, they basically started the same look. But then instead of going in, Miller went out, and the defensive back was looking for the same route as the previous play. So he was wide open. I know it was sort of a pick route, but it also worked without getting a penalty for like the pick route because the defensive backs were backing up because of what happened on that 3rd down play. So there was these like games within the games that the coaching staff did. And I'll just make one more point about that, which is I was not happy that they went to that fade to Strong in the first or second drive. But he basically ran the exact same play, except that instead of the fade, Strong cut in and he scored the first touchdown. So like all that stuff was just setting up, setting up, setting up. And when you look at that, I think there's more in the bag they didn't even have to go to on offense, defense, and special teams. And that's just Soraka. I mean, I think Harsimiak we talked a lot about a week ago, but those are some of my key takeaways from the coaching staff, most of which have been litigated on several of the podcasts already.
Well, two things there. One, the fact that Shiraka was dialing those things up, and again, they were looking to beat Maryland through the air, and B, the evolution of Shiano, I think, in terms of allowing the opening up of the offense and not getting so reliant on the run game. You know, obviously, I think Munungai, I mean, he's played hurt for a while now. He gutted it out. But I think that they realized that, you know, to beat Maryland, they had to score points. And we kind of touched on that in the preview. And they played like it. They played to win. And I think earlier on in the season, we felt like at times they were playing not to lose. And I think that was a huge, it's huge mentally for the team. And I think you see they have the talent, they have the athletes at wide receiver, they have a quarterback that can throw the ball down the field. The offensive line, although is, you know, obviously depth-wise is a little bit of a concern right now. They were able to hold up. And I think more so, you probably confirmed this, you've touched on this before, but, you know, pass blocking is not easier, but it's a little bit more, I guess, the team's able to adjust a little bit better, I think, when they're changing personnel on pass blocking versus run blocking. And it just, they relied on that. And the offense just looked so much more explosive than we've seen in a long time. Even, you know, the Minnesota game was kind of just winning the old way. Obviously, they made some big plays there. But I thought the Maryland game opened up the possibilities for the future and the long-term run here, that this offense can be a lot more than maybe we thought it ever could be, or that Shiano would ever want it to be, just in terms of, you know, complementary football, but also not being as conservative as he kind of seemed to indicate earlier in this year.
Yeah, I would definitely say that the players feel it, number one. The other thing that I think kind of went a little bit under the radar is Rutgers did have plenty of penalties in this game, but they weren't lack of discipline. There's maybe one false start, I think, that set up a 1st and 15, which I think they ultimately got anyway. But for the most part, the penalties were, okay, the one holding call on KJ Duff, which was soft. He still shouldn't have done it, but it was a little bit of a soft call. And then they had 3 pass interference or holding penalties. But against a team like Maryland, there are times to commit the penalty. And you saw Minnesota do this a week ago against Rutgers. Ultimately, it didn't work out for Minnesota. But there were at least 2 defensive penalties where if the guy caught the ball, it was a touchdown. And it was the right play for Rutgers to commit a penalty. Right. So not all penalties are created equal. And I think that's also a sign of good coaching, that if you know your assignment and you know you're burned and you have no safety help, like that's the time to like just grab a guy's shoulder pad and get the holding call or whatever. Again, you don't want to commit penalties, but the penalties that they did commit were playing hard penalties rather than lack of focus penalties. That was definitely a key thing. I want to ask you a question, actually. I think that this was the best game that Rutgers has played as a team since 2014. Probably the UNC bowl game, but you might be able to pick another one during that year. I wouldn't say the game against Maryland when they had the 25-point comeback because they were down by 25 points in that game. But my question to you is, if they played like they played on Saturday for this entire season, again, there's a lot of factors like health and whatever. If they played that way, do you think they would be 8-2 right now on pace, or even 9-1? With the only loss, I still think they would lose to USC, because even if you played as USC, just could not be stopped at all. And I know Rutgers is not at their peak. I just don't, even though USC is below them in the standings, I just don't see it. But other than that, and maybe you have your clunker, whether it's Wisconsin or somebody else, I mean, this team could win any game on their schedule if they played like that. Do you agree? And what do you think is that was the best performance since when?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think, as a team, in terms of both phases, really kind of hitting on all cylinders. I mean, the Miami game comes to mind, but really I don't count that because there were a lot of starters missing from that game for Miami.
Right. Right.
So
I mean,
that
they
was,
beat up Indiana in 2021, but the team stunk.
yeah,
Like,
they definitely didn't have nearly as good of a performance or win, I think, last season. And then if you go back to Sean, I mean, the Michigan State game stands out, but that was kind of a fluky, weird, just COVID year, just
right,
everything
right,
going right, forcing 7 turnovers. So I think you're right in terms of most complete performance. I think you're right. It is the most impressive. And then, I mean, if we go through the Ash era, I don't know. Yeah, it's got to qualify. And then you go into Flood. Probably is true. I mean, 2014, they had some. I mean, the Michigan game was big, but I think you're right. They dominated USC in that bowl game on both sides. It was as impressive a victory as I can remember. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that at all. In terms of what their record would be, I mean, I think the UCLA game is going to be haunting because as good as the UCLA offense was, it was really just the Rutgers defense. Just having such a
right,
terrible game. But I think if you look back, there were signs in that game from the offense that had to like we started to see this build. I think a little bit, maybe without realizing how good it could be. But you saw the offense start to evolve in that game, and maybe just maybe, the offense doesn't open up the way that they have now if they didn't have the need to because the defense struggled so badly. And maybe
right.
that kind of relented Shiano's kind of approach to allow Shiraka to open the playbook a little bit. And then I think the Wisconsin game, I think it's one of those they would have lost no matter what. Physically, I think they just got beat up. But they played obviously terrible on both sides of the ball. I think USC, you're right. I don't think they have the talent to win a shootout against that talented of a team, even though USC has struggled, but they've been on a hot streak. So I think 8-2. I look at the Nebraska loss and the UCLA loss as two that were really it's gonna torment us for a long time, I think, because I think this team definitely could be 8-2. I'm not gonna harp too much on Wisconsin or USC, but 8-2 for sure. The way they're playing right now, I feel like they should have won those 2 games, and the fact that they only lost by 1 score and were so bad on offense against Nebraska and so bad on defense against UCLA, it's frustrating. But again, I think maybe I don't know. I'm kind of thinking off the cuff here. It was a great question, but I do think that the offense kind of, as even in that losing streak, we touched on it, they're not losing because of Ethan Kalik-Manis. They're not
Right.
losing because of the offense. And the offense has kind of evolved over the last few weeks, partly out of necessity because the defense wasn't stopping anyone. So I don't know. I am a firm believer in bad things happen, lead to better things down the road. And maybe those better things wouldn't have happened if those bad things
Right.
never did. So I think that's a little bit of a case there. But yeah, I think when you talk about a complete performance and the fact that you look at a team that had utterly dominated Rutgers 3 years in a row and is visibly more talented just from a ranking standpoint, class
Yeah,
standpoint, it was definitely as impressive as a win as they've had in a very long time, and all that came with it in terms of bowl eligibility, back-to-back years in a decade, all that, and now what it sets it up for the rest of the season.
absolutely. I guess the last point I just want to make in the last minute here is I don't know if we said it on one of the podcasts, but I know I was thinking this when Brian Fonseca was talking about the bowl at the bye week, I should say, which guys were future pros and need to start thinking about their future. And I was saying offline, I didn't think anybody had earned it, whether it be maybe other than maybe Holland Pierce and Monungai because of his body of work.
Yeah.
But in the last 2 weeks, and I know it's a small sample size, but Loyal has shown he's going to get a look. Aaron Lewis has shown, he's battling through injury and he's not just permanently injured the way he looked. Powell played every snap of the last game. Rogers and Longer Beam, a lot comes down to that position about your speed on your testing. Same thing with Flip Dixon. I mean, Igbenog's not a bounce back game. Not sure what will happen with him, but you look at what this defense can do with these potential pros on that side, somewhat healthy, and that's not what we saw earlier in the year, which is
Yep.
both better for the team moving forward, but then also for those players individually, where if any of those guys shut it down the last 4 games, I would have been skeptical that NFL teams would come calling, other than maybe just as an undrafted free agent for probably any of them, but the way other than maybe Powell, who's again it comes out to his medical situation. But, I think now you look at it and you're like, okay, Rutgers does have some players that they can show as success stories for development because other than Lewis, who was definitely a 4-star recruit, most of those other guys were, average 3-star recruits or low 3-star in the case of Monangai or unranked in the case of Pierce. So that was my other key takeaway is there is high-end talent on this team, and they showed it, which is good for the team as well as their own future moving forward.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think part of that too is that it's the perception of the team now, right? So some of these guys on Rutgers that are going to get looks in the NFL, they have the intangible positive now of they were able to fight through adversity. They were able to turn their season around. And that's going to bode well on them for a team to take a chance when Shiano gives that reference, a recommendation, and hey, this guy was a key part of us, getting out of the weeds and pulling ourselves together and having the season that we ultimately did. It's amazing how perception can change. And again, 8-4, if they can get to 8-4 now, it's going to feel like so much better of an 8-4 than we had predicted, both of us, before the season, just because it's circumstantial and just the situations they've had to fight through. And I think it just props these guys up a little bit better, where the talent might be equal to a lot of other prospects going into the NFL draft and the free agent signings. This is why Rutgers gets so many guys signed after the draft. And I think, if it might not lead to more draft picks this year, but I think a lot of these guys are going to get serious looks after because of how they've turned this thing around.
For sure.
All right, David, thanks so much. Drink some hot tea, feel better.
Yeah.
And we'll be back later in the week for a big preview against Illinois. Number 24, Illini coming to SHI Stadium. Can Rutgers end its 15-year drought, 40-game losing streak against ranked opponents? More to come in our conversation and our preview. Thanks so much for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.
Thanks.